Hello, everyone. I'm Vicky Murillo, the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. It is my pleasure to host this seminar on understanding and overcoming vaccine hesitancy in Latin America, a descriptive and experimental study. This study has been put together by a group of graduate students in the political science department and two faculty. And this webinar is co-sponsored by the political science department at Columbia University. The study has been put together and it will be presented by Oscar Pocasangre, graduate student in the political science department, Julian Gerez, graduate student in the political science department, Elena Barham, also graduate student in the political science department. We will be missing Pablo Argote, who couldn't join us, who's also a graduate student, and the two coordinators of the study and colleagues in the political science department, Sean Marshall and Sarah Daly. They will be presenting the study, and then we will have comments by Rodrigo Soares, who's a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs. And then we will open the conversation to everyone with questions and answers. You need to use the Q&A functions for questions. If you write your questions, I will be asking the questions to the presenters. And I also invite you all to follow the Institute of Latin American Studies at our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and you can also watch prior events in YouTube. Both these events will also be recorded and will be available in YouTube. And so please follow us for other fantastic activities that we'll be having through the semester. Thank you to all of you for a presentation, and thanks a lot for putting together this study. So I'll leave it to you.
Great, thanks. I'll take it from here. Well, first of all, thank you, Vicky, for hosting, Esteban for organizing, and many, many thanks, Rodrigo, for being our discussant today. And to the audience, thank you for coming to our presentation of the results of our study. So our study is called Understanding and Overcoming Vaccine Hesitancy in Latin America. As Vicky said, it's a joint effort by the people you see here on the screen, and it's funded by the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy at Columbia. The talk is organized like so. So we're going to start with some background of vaccination in Latin America and an explanation of what we're doing in the study, followed by the vaccine hesitancy, the prevalence of vaccine hesitancy in Latin America. And then we're going to show experimental results from survey experiments that look at the impact on vaccine hesitancy of different types of health information, herd immunity information, willingness to vaccinate information, and different types of appeals to get vaccinated, as well as different type of scenarios of mass vaccine delivery. So I probably don't have to tell people in an ELAS seminar about how bad the COVID-19 pandemic has been in Latin America. The region has truly been very poorly affected by COVID-19. This is a graph from The Economist showing the excess mortality in different countries. You can see places like Mexico and Brazil have had really high rates of excess mortality in the last year. And these are from the last year, and there's a lot of evidence showing that even from 2021, they've had as many deaths as they had in 2020. So it's a continuing crisis in the region. And it's particularly concerning because the region, it has had about 30% of the COVID-19 confirmed deaths in the world, and only has about 8% of the global population. So there is something about the Latin American context, whether uneven state capacity or poor functioning health systems, the informal work that is like quite prevalent in the region that is really affecting the region. So to solve this crisis, we need widespread and speedy vaccination. So once vaccines are available for all, we'll need upwards of 70% of the people in these countries to take up the vaccines. And this is a lower bound of herd immunity. Dr. Fauci in the US has said that it could be even as high as 90%. So this is a lower bound for herd immunity. And vaccination also has to be fast because we want a majority of people to be vaccinated in order to prevent new strains or new mutations that would allow us to go back to some sense of normalcy. And there is already some research from Latin America, especially from public opinion surveys that look at vaccine hesitancy. And they do show that there is about 70% in some countries of vaccine hesitancy, which is concerning because we're not getting to the high levels of herd immunity. But one thing that these surveys don't look at is the speed of vaccination. So how fast you would get the vaccine if it's offered to you. So that's one gap that we're trying to fill in with this study. So as you've probably seen in the news, many of the countries, these are the countries that we have in our study: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. Many of these countries have already started the vaccination campaigns with a variety of vaccines. So there's all the different types of vaccines in the repertoire, including Pfizer, Sputnik, AstraZeneca, some from China as well, Sinovac and Sinopharm. But we still have a lot of uncertainty regarding which of these vaccines are going to be available for the mass public once they're available for everyone. And today we had Johnson & Johnson that was just approved, so it adds one more vaccine to the repertoire. But we don't know which one of these is going to be massively available. This is just some context of how vaccination looks like right now in the region. You can see that Chile is doing a really good job at vaccinating. It has reached a rate of, I think it's about 15 per 100 people that are being vaccinated, followed by Brazil, then Argentina, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, which only started a week and a half ago, if I'm not mistaken. So one concern right now is that right now there's a lot of demand for the vaccine because it's given to all the people who really want it right now, and people in the healthcare system, first responders, are very vulnerable people. But we could expect that these rates are going to plateau once it reaches the population at large and it starts finding resistance to vaccination. So it's been the vaccination process, of course, maybe except in Chile, has been quite bumpy. There have been all these scandals in these countries. For instance, in Peru and Argentina, they've had scandals about people getting the vaccine before, people in government, politicians, getting the vaccine before everyone else. There's also been different elite messaging with regards to the vaccines. Famously, Bolsonaro in Brazil has downplayed the vaccines. He has questioned the quality of Chinese vaccines. And in reference to Pfizer's agreement, which limits liability in the contracts between Pfizer and the buying countries, he said that if you turn into a crocodile, that's your problem. So even putting this idea into people's mind that it could have quite bad effects. And then other presidents have taken other approaches. For instance, Fernandez in Argentina, Piñera in Chile, they publicly got the vaccines. Fernandez got the Sputnik one, Piñera got the Sinovac vaccine. But still, we have a lot of open questions about what this vaccination campaign is going to look like when it reaches the mass public. We don't know the type and effectiveness of the vaccines that people are going to get. We don't know who the vaccine distributors are going to be when it's open for everyone. Mexico recently said that states and the private sector will be allowed to purchase vaccines by themselves. So possibly there's going to be private companies, pharmacies putting vaccines as well. We also don't know what messaging strategy the government's going to take, what information they're going to emphasize, who they're going to use to promote and endorse the vaccines, and the role of media and civil society at promoting vaccine, particularly at tackling vaccine hesitancy. So we take, based on this, we take, these are our main questions for the study. First, we want to get a sense of what is the prevalence rate of vaccine hesitancy in the region across the 6 countries that we study. And we focus particularly on whether you would accept a vaccine if given to you, but also how fast you would accept it, whether you would get it now, or if you would wait 2, 4, 5, 6 months to get the vaccine. We also want to know what type of appeals and information work to reduce vaccine hesitancy. And we're also interested in how do the beliefs about what others are going to do about vaccination affect your own behavior regarding vaccination. Are people going to free ride on the vaccination of others, or are people going to be more willing to get vaccinated if other people are also getting vaccinated? And one final thing we want to test out in the study is how do different vaccines delivery scenarios, like who is giving the vaccine, what type of vaccine you get, who endorses it, how does that affect different dimensions of vaccine hesitancy. So we're all social scientists here, we're all political scientists. So we take a social science perspective on vaccination. So we're thinking about vaccination, particularly herd immunity, as a problem, a public goods problem, right? So usually, and to achieve optimal collective behavior in the provision of public goods, it has certain obstacles, which could be from the lack of information. People might not have the right information about the private benefits for them of chipping in to the public good, in this case, herd immunity. And the other is it could be a collective action problem or a coordination problem where maybe you don't want to get vaccinated because of the cost of vaccination, which could be health related, but also time related or money related. And you want a free ride on everyone else's vaccination. So you want to wait till everyone gets herd immunity and then you don't have to get vaccinated yourself. Or the other is that there's a coordination problem where you want to vaccinate if everyone else is vaccinating, but maybe you don't want to vaccinate if no one else is getting vaccinated. And these type of problems, we propose different ways, particularly messaging ways, to resolve these problems. One is by providing accurate information about vaccines. So from reliable sources, get information about how the vaccines were produced, how they were tested, and how they're safe for people. Also, we want to see what's the effect of providing selective incentives for vaccination. So what happens if we emphasize the altruism aspect of getting vaccinated or a social status aspect of getting vaccinated? Like, will people think better of you if you get vaccinated? Or economic effects like benefits. If the economy is going to recover quicker, if jobs are going to come faster from people getting vaccinated. We also want to know, we also are providing information on how many people are willing to get vaccinated and how many people need to get vaccinated to reach herd immunity. And quite importantly here, we're not providing deceptive information at all. So, and we think this is quite important in the context of a global pandemic where we don't want to contribute to misinformation, which is already quite widespread in the world, and they call it the infodemic. And we think it's quite highly unethical to provide deceptive information or misinformation for the purpose of academic research. So all the information we give here is accurate information and up to date. So we try to make sure it was what we know so far about vaccines. This is an overview of the research strategy. We have surveys in 6 countries in the region, in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. First, the survey is target, we get about 13,000 people, and we asked about vaccine hesitancy in general. And then only among people who report some degree of hesitancy, so we exclude all the people who agree or strongly agree to getting the vaccine and who would get the vaccine within 2 months. And then everyone else continues to the survey. So this is like a survey flow of the survey design. So we start with the screening questions just to get at the overall rate of vaccine hesitancy across the 6 countries. Then we get a pre-treatment questions, so background information on the people, demographics, ideology, information consumption, different type of information. Then we randomize people into 9 different treatments. So there's a control group, a group that only gets information about the health benefits of the vaccine. And we're gonna talk through the scripts of people read later on. A group that gets information about the health benefits and also a message saying that President Biden got the vaccine. Other groups that get varying rates about the herd immunity. So some people see that you need 60% of the people to reach herd immunity. Others see information about 70 or 80%. And then finally, some people who see information about the current rates of the willingness to get vaccinated. Initially, it's from surveys that we can find, and then we started feeding data from our own survey about the willingness of people to get vaccinated. After that, people are then randomized again into 4 different conditions, a control group for comparison, and then we have an altruism condition, which emphasizes the altruistic nature of getting vaccinated, that you're going to contribute to society, you're going to prevent people from getting sick. the economic recovery aspect of it, which emphasizes the returns of jobs and the economy getting better, and a social approval appeal, which says that people might respect you more, you think better of you if you get vaccinated. It's like the good thing to do in a society. Then we measure, we ask the same questions on vaccine hesitancy again, as well as a couple other outcome questions. And people go through 5 different scenarios of mass vaccination, so that we are able to test the effect of different aspects of mass vaccination on vaccine hesitancy. So this is an overview of what we find, so about prevalence of vaccine hesitancy in the region. So the big takeaway from this is that right now, absent any messaging interventions or other public health interventions that could get people to get vaccinated, only 59% of respondents are willing to get a vaccine right now. This is far below the rates required for herd immunity, particularly the lower bound of 70, but very far away from the 90% that Dr. Fauci once suggested. This 59% number is pooled across the 6 countries, but we can see that there's a lot of variation across the country. So Brazil has a high rate of acceptance of the vaccine. It's about 70% of the people agree or strongly agree to getting the vaccine. Meanwhile, countries like Peru, it's about 50% of the people who agree or strongly agree to getting the vaccine. So this is quite concerning. This is showing the length of time, the number of months that people would wait to get vaccinated. Most people would rather wait a couple of months to get vaccinated. So on average, people would wait about 4.3 months to get vaccinated, and only about 48% would get vaccinated within a month, so 0 to 1 months. Again, we also see some variation across countries. A lot of people in Brazil would get vaccinated quite quickly, but countries like Chile and Peru, it seems like people are taking a let's wait and see what happens, or what happens to our neighbors, or if there's more research on the vaccines to get vaccinated. When we look at heterogeneous effects, or how the effects, these are not heterogeneous, this is just like hesitancy among different groups of people. We see that male identifying respondents are more hesitant, so they're more resist vaccination more. And we see higher levels of hesitancy among people in lower socioeconomic groups and in lower educational groups as well. What is it that worries people about vaccines? What makes them hesitant? Far and above, the biggest reason that people give for vaccine hesitancy is side effects. People are worried about getting bad side effects from getting vaccinated, followed by concerns about vaccine development, that the vaccine was developed too fast, and that might affect its effectiveness, or they question the health effects of the vaccine because it was too fast. Followed by mistrust of government. People don't trust the government to be able to give them a good vaccine as well. And then there are concerns about vaccine effectiveness, about costs, which we think is important because reflective of a poor messaging strategy by governments, because these vaccines so far are going to be free for all. So the fact that some people think that cost is going to be an issue might be a problem with messaging. Luckily, we see low rates of general anti-vaccination sentiment in the region, which goes hand in hand with other research and vaccination in the region. Like usually in Latin America with other vaccines, acceptance is quite high, but for COVID vaccines, this is where we're seeing vaccine hesitancy. This is data on the beliefs of what other people will do. We care about this because we think that if you think that a lot of people are getting vaccinated, that might affect your likelihood of getting vaccinated. Likewise, if you think that very few people are getting vaccinated, that might affect your own behavior for vaccination. So as you can see, it's in the range of about 50%. People in Peru think that about 50% of other people are going to get vaccinated, but in other countries like in Brazil, it's higher, it's closer to 75% of people. So people think that 75% of people in their communities are going to get vaccinated. And now I'll hand it over to Julian, who's going to take over for information, the motivation experiments that we have.
Great, thank you so much, Oscar. So with that context in mind, we're going to talk about the result of our first set of experiments that Oscar described initially. So we're dividing this section into two. We have our information treatments and our motivation treatments. I'm going to start by talking about our information design. Oscar did a good job at giving a general overview, but here we're going to get into more detail on each of the scripts in particular, and then also talk about the results for each of them as well. So speaking to the theoretical framework that Oscar talked about during his introduction, the goal in the information design is to remedy this first part of the potential issue, right? If people do not have any information or do not have good information about vaccines, then it's possible that giving them information about vaccines will sort of like remedy these information deficiencies. And then also within this context, we're going to talk about this sort of like collective action or coordination question. So just to go over these four dimensions of variation, we have this simple, straightforward health information context, which we'll see in the next few slides. We're also going to show each of the different, sort of scenarios for the health information and herd immunity and the current willingness and what our Biden script looked like. The idea behind that one was that a prominent politician taking a vaccine would sort of serve as a costly signal of the vaccine safety. So now we'll turn to the first information treatment script. So really what we're highlighting here kind of matches up quite well with what we talked about people's initial concerns were with the vaccine. So we have a few things in bold here, but just to highlight the bulk of the text in general, right? This is all purely positive and accurate information about these vaccines, right? So one thing that we wanted to highlight, in addition to the fact that they're made to prevent disease, is that they were extensively tested, right? So we picked over the choice of words for each of these scripts quite carefully. And we're also highlighting that different countries have approved the use of these vaccines by their own boards, right? Then we also want to highlight further that these tests have shown that these vaccines are safe for use and that they're highly effective. And the second clause of this third sentence here is also quite important, right? That they're effective at both preventing mild COVID infections and severe COVID infections. And finally, the last thing that we're highlighting here is that the side effects are generally minor, right? So speaking to those possible concerns, and that it's not possible to get COVID-19 from these vaccines. I also want to highlight here that people generally understood our information treatments. So we also ran comprehension tests in addition to our post-treatment outcomes for each of the treatments here. So we asked people about, generally what kinds of side effects were associated with the vaccines and whether they were approved in various countries. And we see significant differences between the treatment group and the control group there, right? So the treatment group is more likely to be able to answer those comprehension checks correctly. So then we're going to move to the herd immunity treatment component. So this is sort of like trying to assess the differential effects of giving different levels of herd immunity, right? I think the Fauci interview that Oscar was mentioning said that he was even sort of increasing the bar higher and higher every time he sort of saw that more people were being acceptant, which might be a good thing or might be a bad thing, sort of depending on these on how these collective action or coordination dynamics play out. So this is part of our idea here, in addition to the current willingness, which I'll talk about in just a second. But we're sort of randomizing here whether people receive the information that 60%, 70%, or 80% of people need to be vaccinated. Now, importantly, and in line with the goal of all of our treatments to provide accurate information, is that this range is plausible based on existing scientific research about this. So we looked at this quite carefully, right, and made sure that these were in line with expert findings. And also these numbers will vary on the efficacy of the vaccine, right? So we think these are sort of reasonable and honest bounds for each of these. So now turning onto the community uptake component, Oscar talked about this as well, but sort of in the initial pilot phase of the survey, we talked about, we used existing sort of like estimates of willingness to vaccinate from other studies, but then later on from the survey, we changed that messaging to reflect our own survey data. So respondents would see a message that says that data from this survey indicates that X percentage of people in their country currently say they would get vaccinated against COVID-19, right? And just to give an idea of what this might have looked like, the variation over time, it never exceeded 80% in any country and averaged 67% across countries, as Oscar highlighted. So then finally, we'll turn to our last possible treatment. So again, we gave information about Joe Biden's sort of like status of getting vaccinated. And actually, we interestingly, we ran this while he was, or not exactly while, but in the period that we were fielding the survey, Joe Biden was inaugurated. So our language reflected, you know, the president difference. But anyway, the point of this treatment was to sort of like give a cue that, you know, a prominent politician receiving the vaccine safely sort of serves as a costly signal for vaccine efficacy. So at the time that we were designing the study, not many Latin American countries at some point, even their top politicians were getting vaccines. So this is why we chose Joe Biden also with the intention of giving honest information and making sure that he'd be recognizable to people in the region. Okay, so now we can turn to the results. So just to highlight what's going on in each of these two graphs, the x-axis here represents each of these treatments separated out by each other. So sorry, the text is a little bit small, but hopefully you can see that there. And then the leftmost figure, our outcome of interest is willingness to get vaccinated. And we're turning this into a dummy. So people who say they strongly agree or agree that they would be willing to get vaccinated are coded as 1 here, while others are coded as 0, right? On the right-hand side, we have our months to vaccination outcome. Again, as Oscar mentioned, we want to emphasize the idea that the speediness of the vaccination matters. So this is a big contribution of the study. And just to be clear on what direction this is going in, we recoded things so that positive numbers are always sort of like less vaccine hesitant, right? So it might be a little bit difficult to interpret the months number, but it's reversed such that higher numbers indicate that people would take the vaccine more quickly. So what we find is that there are quite similar treatment effects across each of the conditions, right? So we actually can't reject the null that any of the treatments are, or any of the effects of the treatment are significantly different from each other, except for the health and herd immunity and current willingness treatment, which is the kind of low point you see on the left-hand bar there. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the coordination results. But we do see positive effects from all of the treatments, quite similar in magnitude in terms of like improvement on willingness to get vaccinated and months to get vaccinated. So we can interpret the left-hand chart as a probability point increase, right? And then the right-hand chart is the months to vaccination. So we're the information is on average reducing the amount of months that people would wait to get vaccinated by about half a month and increasing their probability of vaccination by around 0.5 probability points, which translates to around 7.6 persuasion rate. So great, so that's the general sort of like overview for each of the treatment conditions. Given that they're quite similar among each other, these next few slides are showing the effects for any information treatment, right? So we're comparing these these respondents to a peer control group. And we see some interesting heterogeneity by country. So for example, the information treatments aren't having effects in Mexico and Peru. And I also want to highlight on these slides that the rightmost coefficient and dot on each of the graphs is the pooled estimate. So this is the estimate across all countries, while the other ones are each of the results subsetting by individual country. So it looks like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia are driving the results for at least a willingness to vaccinate, but for the speediness of vaccination, it seems to be working across all countries. So turning to a similar graph to what we saw in the introduction, we asked respondents also, after seeing the information that they received, right, based on getting the treatment, how they sort of like might have changed their opinion, and gave them the kind of same responses. So it looks like giving them very simple information, like what I just talked about in terms of the text, you know, makes people less worried about the ineffectiveness of the vaccine, the speed of the development, you know, highlighting that they can't get COVID from the vaccine seem to have affected that as well. So we're seeing, you know, sort of like promising findings just from giving people pretty costless information, right? So this is a pretty brief treatment, so that's promising. So now we can talk about heterogeneity by respondents, right? So who's responding differentially to this information, and encouragingly, we find that this, and also we should highlight that these results are all for people who we have declared as hesitant already, right? So these are results among the hesitant, just to emphasize that. But in terms of like within subgroups of the hesitant, we don't see any big differences across groups. So it's not, with the exception of this gender variable, right? So the information seems to be more effective for female identifying respondents, but we don't see any significant differences, you know, for example, by political preference. So, you know, even in Brazil and Mexico, respondents, you know, who say that they would vote for AMLO and Bolsonaro, that was one of the pre-treatment covariates that we asked about, were not less likely to respond positively to these information treatments. So that's definitely an encouraging result there. So next we'll turn to the herd immunity results. So this is a little bit more complex, but hopefully it should be intuitive. So telling people about the current vaccination rate within their country in general increases the willingness to vaccinate. But if they receive a herd immunity treatment that is higher than what the current rate that they got, right? So if people think that there's more ground to make up in terms of getting to herd immunity, then it might decrease willingness to vaccinate, right? So this is suggestive evidence that individuals are more willing to sort of like chip into the public good of vaccination when it's more likely that herd immunity is achieved. So actually, at least, you know, when importing it to the Latin American context, Fauci's idea of sort of like increasing the threshold each time might not be as beneficial, right? So the takeaway here is that people aren't sort of like interested in free riding on the herd immunity, and rather that this is complementarity. So we'll turn to the graph of these results next. So what we see here on the left and right hand side are each of the two outcomes that we've talked about. In general, we see this more prominently with the willingness to vaccinate outcome, but we see the same dynamic, though less pronounced, on the quickness of vaccination outcome. But the middle coefficient sort of tells you that when the current willingness exceeds the herd immunity prediction, then people are more likely to want to be vaccinated, whereas the rightmost coefficient on the left-hand side, so the current and the little time sign current below herd, is suggestive evidence that people are less likely to want to be vaccinated when they think they won't reach that herd immunity goal. So to summarize these information effects, we find that our information treatments increase vaccine acceptance and decrease time to vaccination, though there's certainly heterogeneity across countries. And given that, you know, you all are experts in your particular countries in the region, we'd love to hear feedback about that. And similarly, so sort of like summing up, the information treatments do help sort of address these concerns about safety and efficacy, and we find results consistent with the coordination logic. So next we'll turn to the motivation experiment. So the idea here was to sort of like figure out how different motivations for vaccination might affect people. So in addition to these information treatments, folks might have gotten an appeal to altruism, to economic recovery, and to social benefits. So we find that in general, in line with the coordination logic, actually, social approval is the sort of most effective way to motivate people to get vaccinated. While we don't find much for altruism, and a little bit of effects on economic recovery, and we'll dive into each of those across countries in these next few slides. So for altruism, again, we sort of like tried to prime respondents by saying that if they got vaccinated against COVID-19, they'd help others in their community, it'll protect the most vulnerable, and so on and so forth. And we find, so again, the rightmost coefficient in each of the plots is the pooled estimate. But in general, very little sort of like movement on the altruism component, although interestingly, Chile and Colombia seem to be more responsive to this altruism prime. Turning to the economic prime, the core idea here was to say that the faster that each respondent's country is able to stop the spread of COVID-19, the better people are able to get back to work, and the more people can help the economy recover, right? So it's interesting that this might be a little bit selfish or a little bit community driven, but in any case, we find in general a little bit of sort of positive effects based on the economic treatment, but not nearly as strongly compared to the social treatment, which we'll turn to next. But just to spend a little bit more time here, we do find again that Chile is quite responsive here in terms of the willingness to vaccinate outcome, and similarly with Brazil on the months to vaccination outcome. Interestingly, we find that in Peru, the economic treatment actually made people want to get vaccinated less quickly. Or suggestive evidence of that, I should say. So finally, the most successful motivation-based intervention, so recall in comparison to the information treatments, which were quite effective all around, we see less strong effects in terms of the motivation, except for the social prime here, right? And that connects to the same coordination story that we were talking about earlier, right? So this prime sort of tries to tell people that if they get vaccinated, they're going to become more respected by the people in their community, right? And here we do find effects pooled across all countries, right? So that's the last set of coefficients on each side of the graph. And in particular, strong results in Chile and Brazil there for willingness to get vaccinated and months to get vaccinated, respectively. So to summarize what we find from the motivation effects, social incentives are the best way to effectively motivate our survey respondents, right? Priming or accentuating these reputational benefits seems to be the best way to go about this. And we find some interesting forms of subnational variation that we'd love to get into more details about in the Q&A, right? So we're seeing, even though there are no average effects of altruism across all countries, respondents in Chile and Colombia respond positively to altruism. A similar story in terms of the economic prime, that we do find effects there across all countries, and in particular, the social effects are largest in Chile and Brazil. So having considered vaccination in the abstract, I'm gonna turn the presentation to Elena, who's gonna talk specifically about specific features of the vaccination distribution. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julian. So I'm gonna take us through the scenario component of our survey and then talk about the results from that, and then get into some conclusions and policy recommendations. And then I'm really looking forward to opening up the floor for feedback, both from Rodrigo and from everyone who's been so gracious to attend today. So in this last component of our survey, we're trying to look a little more specifically at potential scenarios for vaccine rollout. And the goal of these scenarios is to experimentally vary certain traits that the rollout might involve. We selected our traits based on things that seem like they're relatively likely to be kind of like core components of any country's rollout strategy. So here we're going to focus on vaccine producer and country, which vaccine is available in the vaccine rollout, the phase 3 trial efficacy of that vaccine, who's endorsing that vaccine, so who's publicly speaking to encourage uptake, who's distributing the vaccine, so who am I going to as somebody who's seeking to get vaccinated in order to obtain my vaccination, and then finally this community take-up rate, which again is helping us understand the relevance of coordination and collective action here. So we use, I'm going to walk through the scenario text just so you have a sense of where these components are fitting in, and then we'll talk about the ways that these axes are varying. So for this scenario text, we're just showing the respondent these 2 paragraphs, and what we're doing in this text is varying along these axes of variation that shape up the scenarios. So we're going to put the country, we'll have the producer matched with the country that the vaccine was produced in. Optionally, people will get a prime about the efficacy rate that pertains to that vaccine, again, accurately pertains to that vaccine. There's no like, you only get the accurate efficacy rate if you get one. Then we mentioned that it's free, so to kind of dissuade this cost concern, and mention the endorser, so who's encouraging uptake. And then finally, we state who it's being implemented by and either give no information about community uptake, or we're going to give one of a number of different pieces of information about community uptake. And again, I just want to emphasize that the survey made it very clear that these are hypothetical scenarios, so people understand that this isn't like, each one isn't the plan that they're necessarily going to be involved in. So moving forward to the components of variation, we have these 5 core ways that our scenarios are varying. So the first is in the vaccine, and respondents are getting both the vaccine and the country of its origin. So Pfizer in the US, AstraZeneca in the UK, the Gamaleya Institute vaccine from Russia, the Sinovac vaccine from China, and then an unspecified vaccine in some scenarios. You get, in some cases, a phase 3 trial efficacy. And again, this is the efficacy that pertains to the vaccine that was given in the prior part of the prompt. In some cases, respondents get an unspecified efficacy, in which we just omit that section of the text. Then any of these endorsers, so president, the mayor of a municipality, the National Medical Association, religious leadership, which is matched to the religious identity of either Catholics or evangelicals responding to the survey, so you get kind of like the right leader for you. And then a left or right-leaning newspapers. On the distribution access, we're varying among what kind of have been emphasized in debates about 3 ways that rollout might happen in the region. So that's focusing on the national healthcare system, focusing on the military, and focusing on civil society as potential actors that are administering this vaccine. I think maybe if we could redo it now, we'd have more of like a private component in there as well, but these are still kind of helping us explore some of the really plausible possible administrators. And then finally, we're going to vary the take-up rate, so from 1 to 25 to 50 to 75%, or in some cases, we're going to omit that prime altogether to have a pure control. And so just to talk a little bit about assignment, we've kind of made this as non-technical as possible, but just so that you have a general sense of this portion of the survey. Each respondent is going to get 5 different scenarios of these, and after each scenario, we're going to ask our core questions. So that's the willingness to vaccinate and the time to vaccination. For these dimensions that are unspecified, we were concerned that if you had gotten a specified dimension and then later you get an unspecified one, you might be anchoring and just thinking and assuming that it's still the prior one that was specified in this unspecified scenario. So we're going to restrict these unspecified categories to respondents who have not already seen a specified outcome. So in effect, this means that you get, if you're going to get an unspecified category, usually it's in the first or second round of these 5 scenarios that you're seeing over the course of the survey. Luckily for us, all of the combinations of the scenario were relatively realistic, so we don't have to omit any of the possible combinations because the parts aren't really in conflict with each other. And then finally, when we're analyzing this, we're going to use respondent and round fixed effects just to be precise about our estimation. So to talk through some of the results, I know that the coefficient plot is a little bit overwhelming, but there are some kind of general trends that we can take out of this. So this is looking at willingness to vaccinate as an outcome. And the kind of core pieces of information that we want to take away from this are all fairly intuitive. So first, if we look at the first 5 rows, we're seeing these are the efficacy results. And as you can see, the higher efficacy vaccines are prompting a greater willingness to accept. And again, this is holding the actual vaccine constant. So comparing the Gamaleya vaccine with and without the 91%. When you get that 91% buy-in, it shifts you to be more willing to take the vaccine. And so that's fairly intuitive, right? It makes sense to us that people would be more willing to take a higher efficacy vaccine, and that reminding them of the high efficacy would help their willingness. Next, if we look down at the next 4 rows, the next 5, we can look at the uptake. And so this also is looking really intuitive, right? So the 1% uptake is not at all encouraging. In fact, it's discouraging for people to take the vaccine. But as we get up into 50 to 75% uptake, people are more willing to take it. And again, this reflects the logics that perhaps now at this stage, herd immunity is within reach, right? So that's like one possible way that people could be reasoning about this and why you might be willing to take it when more people are taking it. You might also think that maybe you have a better sense that it's safe now because more people have taken it. So I think this is something that we'll hopefully be able to address later on. If we look at producers, there's kind of clear findings that the non-Western, in quotes, vaccines are dispreferred to the Western vaccines. So we can see that the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines are slightly positive when compared to an unspecified vaccine, whereas the Gamaleya and Sinovac vaccines are people are less willing to take them, again, relative to an unspecified vaccine. I think it's worth kind of wondering if people are like benchmarking what a vaccine is to Western vaccines or Western produced vaccines. And I think it's also interesting the variation between the Sinovac and the Gamaleya vaccine. And I will talk about later in the presentation whether there's something we can learn from that difference. So then finally moving down into the endorsements and the distribution, here what we really see is just resoundingly that people want healthcare professionals both endorsing and giving them the vaccine. So in both of these categories, we're using medical professionals as our base relative to which we're estimating all of these other effects. And we can see that all of the endorsers do worse than an endorsement from medical professionals, and both of the other distributors do slightly worse than distribution through the national health system. So regardless of whether people don't particularly trust or appreciate their national health system, they still would prefer it to other options in terms of obtaining a vaccine. If we want to look now at the next set of outcomes, this is the months to vaccination, is really incredibly similar. So we see more or less the same patterns where higher efficacy, higher uptake, Western vaccines and medical distributors and endorsers are really the preferred kind of configuration of traits for vaccine rollout. So again, to summarize the scenario results, we do see this preference for Western vaccines, and then among the non-Western vaccines, the Gamaleya vaccine is looked upon more favorably than the Sinovac. Higher efficacy and higher population uptake nudge people in the direction of taking the vaccine as well as taking it sooner. And people have a relatively homogeneous preference for health professionals relative to other actors that can be acting in this space. And these results are holding across both months to vaccination as well as vaccine acceptance. So they're kind of working on both of the dimensions that we think are really important. So the last thing I want to talk about with like relevance to these scenario experiments are looking among different correspondents, some subgroups, to see kind of like which respondents are more affected by different primes and who's reacting more positively. And so in our kind of battery of pre-experimental questions that we asked respondents, we included questions to gauge trust in all of these different entities. So the relevant governments for the vaccine producer countries, the political and civil society actors that we use as endorsers, as well as the potential institutions that are used to distribute the vaccines. And we see some variation. So in the vaccine producer countries, we see really strong effects in terms of how trust mediates your willingness to take a vaccine from each of these countries. So across all of these vaccines, we see increased willingness and reduced time to vaccination among people who trust the government under which that vaccine was produced. We see these effects also, but they're less consistent for the endorsers. So for the mayor, the president, and religious leadership, we see the same kind of like both increasing willingness and reducing time to vaccination for people who express high levels of trust in the relevant endorser. We also see an increase in willingness for the news endorsements, but we do not see the same reduced time to vaccination. So even if people trust their newspaper, it might persuade them to get the vaccine, but in our results, they don't get it more quickly. And then finally, we do see some weak effects of trust in the distributor, and these are really clustered in the Army. So there is some heterogeneity and willingness to like be more willing to get vaccinated or to reduce time to vaccination when you're in the army scenario among people who trust the army more, but we don't see something similar for civil society groups, which perhaps is understandable because it is a little hard to quantify your overall trust in civil society. I think it's a little more tangible to understand that like the army is a relatively consolidated actor. So that's a potential reason for that. But we still don't see as much motion here in terms of trust. The coefficient estimates are smaller as well. Okay, great. So moving into our conclusions, I just want to give a quick overview because I know that we've thrown a lot at you over the course of this presentation. So first, in terms of our kind of general inclusive of hesitant and non-hesitant people, like we find that there's a 42% on average hesitancy rate across countries in our sample, and people are waiting a little over 4 months to get vaccinated, which are probably both not optimal in terms of both herd immunity and outpacing disease mutations, which obviously we would all like to avoid. We find in our information, when we now look just among the hesitant, moving from these general population estimates, we find that both information and social incentives can reduce hesitancy, both in terms of willingness to accept a vaccine as well as to get vaccinated more quickly. And then in our hypothetical scenarios, we are finding variation in terms of certain vaccines, certain levels of efficacy, and certain endorsements that are all able to help potentially guide a rollout program that would harness greater uptake or create greater uptake among the population. So we've tried to kind of think as well through the limitations and outstanding questions of this study, and we see a lot of room here for potential follow-ups. So the first kind of general word of caution for our findings is that we really only know the randomized effects among the hesitant, right? Because we screen out non-hesitant respondents before we move into that component of the study. So if people are already motivated to get vaccinated, we're not sure if these sorts of primes will continue pushing them in the direction of getting motivated, or if we believe some other behavioral evidence will crowd out people's other incentives, right? And so it's worth thinking about if we're going to target these sorts of ad campaigns and stuff at like the broader population that includes both the hesitant and the non-hesitant, we're going to want to potentially understand if there's any risk of discouraging uptake among people who are not previously hesitant. The second kind of important limitation of our study is that we have very limited behavioral evidence. So all of these are kind of just like willingness outcome measures, and which we think are informative and helpful to understand how people are reasoning about this, but it would be very helpful to know if these people actually do go on to get vaccinated at higher rates as their acceptance would predict. And so we see room here to do some sort of follow-up in terms of resurveying or recanvassing once people who have had an option to enroll. And then the last kind of intertwined effect that we, again, would like to follow up and look into, but can't assess at the moment, is about the durability of effects. So is this, do these prompts change your opinion long enough for you to answer the question, or is there some sort of like lasting impact on how people are thinking about their willingness to vaccinate? And this is another place where a follow-up study, I think, would be very helpful for us to understand the ultimate like longer term effects of this sort of information. We have a handful of kind of cautious but clear policy recommendations from the evidence from our study. So probably the most non-controversial component is that ad campaigns should really just mainstream clear information about safety and efficacy. We found that to be very important and very convincing to people, and we appreciate that that's one of the kind of like least like politically toxic ways that you could go about conducting an ad campaign, so we'd like to encourage that. We also found that endorsements by medical professionals and just overall like centering medical professionals in the administration and rollout and public communication processes are, again, like most neutral and most appreciated by study participants. And so rather than kind of involving other actors, we'd really recommend that public health ministries, officials, and medical associations remain relatively central to vaccination campaigns in the messaging as well as in the vaccination itself. And then we do see a potential benefit to emphasizing social gains or social benefits to the vaccine, right? So if there's these kind of costless interventions that you could do, including like I got vaccinated stickers or ways for people to kind of bolster the social like reinforcement, right, for their uptake. And we think that these might be worth looking into on the part of governments who want relatively cheap ways to improve uptake based on our results. And so then finally, we have some outstanding questions and some areas that we'd really love input from this audience. So our results are really not conclusive about how to message about vaccines which are modestly effective. All of these coefficients overlap with 0, and it's not really clear if it's better to state the efficacy or not in those cases. And this might be, again, a place where understanding how this generalizes to a non-hesitant crowd could be important. We also don't really know how to reduce hesitancy about non-Western vaccines. Our design was intended to estimate that, but not to address it. And so this might be a potentially really important question for the region moving forward, given that a lot of countries are not going to be primarily using the Pfizer or the AstraZeneca vaccines. Additionally, we are able to address a handful of reasons for hesitancy, but our design, again, was not really meant to engage questions of mistrust of government or other more sociological or socio-political reasons that people might not be willing to take a vaccine. And this, I mean, that was like one of our most significant drivers of hesitancy. So we also think that this would be an important thing for research to address or to potentially follow up on. And then finally, we understand that governments are making choices, right, among alternatives. So it's not like either you do nothing or you take our advice. And so we think it's very important to start bringing our results into broader conversations about the effectiveness of other types of tools for hesitancy reduction so that governments can kind of make the best possible decisions and encourage the best possible uptake of their vaccine programs. So thank you guys so much. We're really looking forward to getting feedback and to opening up the floor for some discussion. Any of these prompts we'd be happy to hear about, and also just any thoughts that came up during the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to all of you. We have now Rodrigo Suarez. We'll start with the comments and that we will open for general discussion. Rodrigo?
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for the invitation. And I want to thank John and Julian and Oscar and Sarah and Elena as well for the opportunity to be discussing their paper. Let me just share my screen quickly here. So it was a very interesting paper to read and very easy to read as well. So I think it's obviously very relevant. Let me just go quickly with an overview of the paper and then go into more specific comments, right? I think it was pretty clear. I think the authors did a very good job in presenting. So the paper, what it does in a nutshell is basically choose information, kind of an information revelation experiment to assess the responsiveness of stated vaccine acceptance to different types of information, right, being provided. So there's health, there's like societal uptakes and information about herd immunity levels, social motivations, and support of endorsement or support of different political and social actors. And I think I'm going to repeat some of the things that I already said during the presentation. I think that really the most important and hopeful results, somewhat surprising, I guess, in my view, a positive surprise, is that really that in very basic and simple direct health information seems to increase the acceptance significantly and quite substantially as well in quantitative terms, right? So I'm not sure this is something that I would have expected, and I think it's in terms of policy is a very hopeful message, right? And also other pieces of information seem to have an effect, in particular a motivational message related to social approval, right? I think the paper is super relevant, obviously. I don't even have to say that given our current context, but not only, I was going to mention that in the end, I can anticipate not only because of that, actually, vaccination rates have been coming down in most of the developed world and also in a fair part of the developing world. Actually, the developing world that had robust vaccination programs, right? So vaccination has been coming down over the last 10 years. I don't think we fully understand that. So I think this has a broader relevance that also surpasses the current COVID crisis, right? I think it's overall convincing. I think the basic results are very convincing. And I think it has obviously very clear and immediate implications in terms of policy. I'm going to try to concentrate my specific comments on framing, on interpretation of the results, and on some details about the research design. These are more punctual things that I can, if I don't have time, I can actually talk to the authors later on in terms of the research design. So in terms of framing, I'm going to say something that may sound a little counterintuitive and controversial, but I think I mean this is something that I think is present in the paper, but also it's been recurrent in the public debate, right? So there is an effort in the paper, and I think in the media, generally speaking, to associate what the way that the pandemic is playing out in Latin America, particularly to socioeconomic conditions, to inequality, to informality, and to say that in some sense it's been particularly serious in Latin America. First of all, I think it's very difficult to make this comparison before the pandemic has actually run its course, right, in different locations. So different countries are at different stages of this cycle, of this long cycle. So it's very difficult to make this kinds of statements or calculations, right? Having said that, when we look in per capita terms, actually most of Latin America is considerably below the US, below, I would say, virtually all Western Europe, with very few exceptions. And this is particularly true if we exclude Mexico, right? So it's true when we look at these relative numbers and the number of cases and population for Latin America, they look bad. But this is basically an issue of Western Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere, right? If you look within the Western Hemisphere, if you compare North America, South America, and Europe, in relative terms, right now, actually, South America is probably the one that's coming out with the least worst shape in terms of mortality numbers per capita, right? And probably cases as well, but cases there are more serious issues of reporting. So there is a need. There are several other issues of connection, of urbanization that we don't understand very well. I think we don't understand very well what's going on in certain parts of Asia, in South Asia, or in Africa. But the fact is that actually, when you look at the Western Hemisphere, Latin America doesn't look too bad in the picture. It's not an outlier, right? And obviously, in terms of the social consequences of the crisis, inequality and lack of public good provision, and poverty overall, obviously these are going to have major consequences in terms of the social cost of the crisis. But in terms of the pandemic itself, up to now, and there's still a lot to play out. There's the variants that are going around. The Brazilian variant, we don't know how it's going to be in the end. But up to now, actually, Latin America doesn't look particularly bad within the Western Hemisphere, right? And so it's not an outlier, right? And I think, again, I know that this goes against much of what has been said in the public debate recently. In terms of the issue of vaccine acceptance, also the paper tries to motivate a little bit. It's not explicit, so I'm more reading in between the lines, but there is this feeling that it would be a more serious issue in Latin America. It seems to be the case. But I've looked at a bunch of different survey numbers across the world. If anything, actually, also, it seems that Latin America is slightly better than US and Western Europe in terms of acceptance in the baseline, let's say, right? From a broader perspective, I think that's actually good for the paper. I think that makes the paper much more appealing. I think it's an issue about acceptance of vaccines that is an issue in the Western world today, right? And much more general. I took like a figure from one recent paper published in Nature by Lazarus, which is just a survey across countries. But there are other numbers like this. They're going to be slightly different. They're slightly different from yours. Obviously, this is going to depend on the phrasing a little bit. This one was, if a COVID-19 vaccine is proven safe and effective and it's available, I will take it, right? But I saw a presentation recently by an epidemiologist that had other numbers, but let's say the distribution of countries wasn't very much different from these, right? And you see that in Latin America, actually, overall doesn't look too bad, right? So Brazil is up here. Mexico is not too bad. We have Ecuador. This is not a super representative sample, but when you look at Western Europe, France has very low numbers. Here it's close to 60%. Actually, in the other survey that I saw, it was below 50%, actually. And again, the wording was a little different. It's pretty low in Sweden, in Germany as well. So just the issue of framing, I think several of the issues discussed here are much more appealing than only, they're not really only Latin American issues. That's what I would say, right? They're actually broader issues. And I think in some sense, the motivation, the initial motivation of the paper could go in that direction, right? Moving on, in terms of interpretation of the results, I think, as I mentioned before, I think the most interesting and relevant result in my view is really the one related to pure and simple scientific information, health information. I think it's very simple, it's unequivocal, it's very easy to translate into policy. I would be very interested in understanding how it may actually depend on context, right? Economic or cultural, social capital, trust in the government. So I saw that, for instance, the effect was much lower in Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. It was Mexico and Peru. I may be wrong, but and I think it took, obviously you have a small sample of countries, so it's difficult to do that within your sample, but the broader issue of trying to explore exactly what's behind the responsiveness to the pure scientific information, right? Whether people from groups that would be, let's say, ethnic groups that would be excluded somehow feel are less trustworthy of the overall public health apparatus or not. So I think that would be super, super interesting. The other dimensions, I think they are a little less straightforward to interpret theoretically, even though I think they're very useful for policy in terms of, some of them are very useful for policy design as well, right? The paper actually, when looking at all the different pieces of evidence, I think it sticks to a very, very like strict rational choice perspective. And it's a little ironic that I'm the economist and have Gary Becker as my advisor. I'm the one that's bringing up this point. But it's really a super, super rational choice perspective with, and I think Elena actually in the end raised this point in the very last slide, if I'm not mistaken. So she said other concerns related to acceptance may be relevant. And I do think they're very relevant, right? And I think when we open up for identitary concerns or other behavioral considerations, some of the later results, the results that come later on, I think they could have different interpretations, right? And I mean, it doesn't invalidate empirical strategy, nor the policy implications, just in terms of how we think of what's going on, right? And I'm gonna give one example, right? So the results related to societal uptake, right? So they are interpreted, and this is repeated a couple of times throughout the paper. I think you guys put a lot of weight on this, the collective action problem, right? The idea that people may be reluctant to be vaccinated unless they know that other people will be vaccinated, and this is going to be enough to reach herd immunity. So on itself, I find this argument a little puzzling, because actually the private benefit from vaccination is higher the lower the number of people vaccinated is. Right? If everybody is vaccinated, then my incentive to vaccinate is very low, because it probably doesn't make any difference because the virus is not going around. It doesn't really matter, right? If nobody is vaccinated, actually the gain from vaccinating privately is humongous, right? So it's a bit weird, the argument in my view, and in terms of the relative effects of herd immunity and personal immunity, right? So there is the private benefit of vaccination, and the private benefit can be very, very large, right? And it's going to be larger the lower the level of vaccination is in the population. So I find it a little puzzling, this argument by itself, right? If we bring to the discussion the idea that people may have biases about the beliefs of others, of what's like the common norm, how people are seeing the world, whether they live in a bubble or whether they have the average opinion or not, actually, this may open up other interpretations for these results, right? So I could think of like identity concerns and also of informational update, right? I think informational update is very simple. Maybe I look at the number of people who think that the vaccine is good, and I say, oh, well, everybody thinks it's good, it must be good. So maybe I was wrong. I wasn't following things very well. So I should change my opinion, right? So that's just kind of an issue of non-rational expectations. People don't understand really the world, and then they update their expectations based on what they see other people doing, right? The issue of identity concerns, I think, is related. I do think it's very relevant on these things, right? I think people want to be seen as belonging to a specific group, and they may believe that their group is doing A or B, right? When they don't have a clear understanding. I mean, this dimension sometimes may be more appealing than other dimensions, right? And when you actually review information about this distribution of opinions to people, they may actually update how their group actually is behaving, right? Or whether their group is actually an average group or not. Maybe they thought that they were kind of the median representative group in the population, and maybe they figure out that actually maybe I was in a bubble and there is 80% of the people that have this opinion, and I thought that everybody had a different opinion. So this may lead people to realign their choices and behaviors, not because they're updating the probabilities and their aligned numbers, right? Just because in terms of probabilities, right? Just because they are updating what the average guy does, and they want to be kind of close to the average or something like that, right? To the majority, they feel that they are majority and they want to belong to the majority, right? Something along those lines, right? So I think these things are very important. I think they are really downplayed. I mean, they are not actually mentioned in the paper. And then I think Elena mentioned it in the end of the presentation. I think they should be brought into the discussion in a more throughout the paper, right? And I mean, and these two alternatives, I think they should be discussed as things that can be happening at the same time in principle, right? But this first argument that I discussed, I do have a hard time actually getting my head around it. I don't know if I missed part of the argument. Okay, I think I already went over time a little bit. I think there are some things of research design I can mention very broadly. I think I would like to see more precise and detailed discussion of some aspects. So, for instance, sampling, right? So you mentioned that there's a representative online panel. I mean, exactly how it's representative, it's online. I mean, it's not really clear to me how you would achieve representativeness, given that you're taking it are you actually sampling from a pool of people that can be interviewed? And then you move on to do the trimmering, right? You only want to look at people who have some reservation in relation to vaccines. So we're actually cutting the sample in different ways in different countries. So that's a step that I wasn't sure exactly if we thought that actually whether the receptiveness of people, the acceptance of vaccines would be a little bit endogenous to the issues that we're discussing here, like to state capacity, to the effectiveness of the public health system. I think cutting this first step in a way that might be endogenous to this setting across different countries might be a little problematic. So I'm not sure. I mean, I would have to think a little more about that, right? Another thing that I think would be good to have a deeper discussion about, and I think actually it was much better in the presentation than in the paper, right? The issue of like the sequential nature of treatments, right? So for the later treatments in particular, this also makes me a little apprehensive in terms, I think they're still random and so on and so forth, but there are treatments that are coming on top of previous treatments. And potentially there is a bunch of heterogeneity going on, right? Maybe you're giving these treatments to people that received quite different treatments. I could imagine that this might actually increase the variance of outcomes generally, these interactions, and I don't know what this would do to the variance of outcomes, right? And precision of estimates and power in terms of estimation, right? So I think also I got a little bit lost there, right? So I think a more conceptual discussion about issues of, particularly because of the sequence of questions, right, that some people are facing, the discussion of issues of priming, I've heard this interviewer asking something before, and then when I'm asked something else later on, and I'm presented with an experiment later on, is it the case that this thing that the interviewer told me before actually may be affecting my behavior? Maybe I'm going to be willing to conform more to later questions exactly because I got a feeling from the guy in the first stages of the process of what they're expecting later on. So I think there are issues. I mean, these are issues that are always present. It's just that I think we should discuss them a little more explicitly about throughout the paper, right? And the last thing I want to mention is related to a point I think that Elena raised. I think that the revelation of information about efficacy, I think it was very crude in some sense, right? Because I think people don't have the subtlety of what this actually means, right? So one thing that could be done, and I already wrote it here, and you actually asked for this type of comment, right? Would actually be to put this into perspective, right? So efficacy rates of 50, 70% for vaccines that we have been using for 30 years are completely standard. This is actually the norm, right? So I think the flu vaccine rarely goes above 60%, and there are years when the flu vaccine is actually like 40%, it's below 50, right? And people don't understand that. People don't have this understanding. The other thing is actually related to efficacy against different outcomes, right? So even these ones that had relatively lower efficacy, like 50 to 60 to 70%, when you look at like hospitalization rates, most of them actually had efficacy rates above 85%, right? So this would be something that I think would also change a little bit the perspective and would be very valuable in terms of finding a way to give this information about efficacy more effectively. Right? So just to conclude, I think it's a very nice paper. I think the main results are very credible. It has very clear and actionable implications. I think for me, personal taste, there's a little bit of too much going on when you have the successive treatments on top of each other. I would, if you guys are still thinking about going back and running something similar to this, I would try to focus on the key aspects that you found here, maybe a combination of health information and the motivation with the social approval message, and then maybe actually broaden it to a larger set of countries. And obviously, as you also said, I think Elena said, to try to follow it on, to try to see whether you could actually see some effects on actual vaccination rates when this starts playing out, right? As I mentioned before, I think the relevance surpasses the issue of the COVID crisis. I think this is an issue for public health today in the developed country, in the developed world, and also in the middle, let's say, middle-level developing world, right? So I think it's very important and very nice to read. It's a congratulations on the work. Sorry about going over time, Vicky.
Rodrigo, guys, maybe we want to open to comments, or do you want to respond to Rodrigo? What do you want to do?
I think maybe since we're a little short on time, it makes sense to open it up and try to get as much feedback.
Okay, if anybody
possible.
has comments, please write them in the Q&A. So I would call you if you write your name in the Q&A. I think I have the opportunity to allow people to talk, but I need to know who wants to talk. I have a bunch of comments or questions to start, and then I'll get it. One, in response to Rodrigo, comment about Latin America not being as bad in death as Western Europe and the United States. Given the age distribution, the demographics of Latin America, I'm not sure you're right? Because this is a much younger population, so you would expect fewer deaths. So I'm not sure that controlling for the age of the population, Latin America did not do worse than Europe and the United States. I don't know the answer, but
maybe, I mean, of course, I should have mentioned that there is this difference. Of course, it would look a little worse. Maybe it would look slightly worse in the end, but it wouldn't be outrageously different. That's my point,
okay,
right?
yes.
And actually, I mean, the raw numbers are actually substantially lower right now, right? So I don't even want to emphasize the substantially lower, but you're right, but it wouldn't be anything like 200% higher or anything like that. It would be far from that.
That's right. So then I have a comments on the results. So a bunch of them, as I was writing them, the kind of nationality of the vaccination, the Gamaleya effect you found, I think that it might have changed because now we know that the Gamelaya is better than the AstraZeneca. So, I mean, I've noticed this in Argentina now. Everybody wants the Gamelaya and they don't want the AstraZeneca because there was a Lancet report that showed that it was much more effective. So before there was no information. That's still true for Sinovac. So maybe the only thing you're capturing is what the press tells you about the real effective effect of the vaccine, rather than some national discrimination effect. Because once the data is there, you know, the distrust for the Russian vaccine evaporated pretty fast, at least in Argentina. That's what I saw. So I don't know if those two effects are really different. So that was one comment. I totally agree, you know, with Rodrigo. From my current experience, everybody wants access to the vaccine, not to save the country, but to save themselves. So this kind of collective herd immunity doesn't seem to be in the mind of anyone that I know that got the vaccine. So that's something to think about. And I was thinking that there might be some effect from the prior experience. So what is the experience within the country with vaccination? What is the experience of individuals that you asked with vaccination before? And there might even be variation, heterogeneity within countries that explains what's going. I mean, that's pretty common in the United States, but it probably is true because in some areas, especially in countries like Mexico, you know, the state is totally absent in health terms in certain areas and not in others. There's very much heterogeneity. And I'm not sure if with the online, you know, I assume you can locate the people, right, in demographically, and you locate them geographically. And that might make more sense to pull people even across countries. There might be something going on within countries that allows you to assess the effect. And I know we've been talking about partisanship. I know partisanship showed no effect, but in what seems to be important in the literature is co-partisanship, right? Not partisanship. So you tend to distrust more. So if the effect was just getting someone of your own party, that should have increased the effect. Although I know if you give me someone of the other party, that would increase. So I remember we had this discussion before the report. What I thought, before you ran the experiment, what I thought was bad was, you know, inducing, I don't know, someone to hear that the guy from the other party supports the vaccine, because that, at least, you know, most of the literature tell us it reduced my willingness. But having someone of the same party, like you did with religion, should not have had that effect. And I think it, you know, again, not the experimental studies, but the other studies that are around suggest that this in some countries might have some effect. If you plan to go for a second round. Let me see, there's now a bunch of questions. Okay, Kiara, okay, where is Kiara? Here, somewhere. Okay, I'm gonna read it because I cannot find her. So Kiara asked, do you have a sense of what kind of vaccine campaigns or information your respondents had already been exposed to in real life, and if there was significant difference between hesitant and non-hesitant? Second, did you check about heterogeneous effects with vulnerability, for instance, age, since there are some groups that we hope to vaccinate more quickly? Since there's some groups, sorry about that. Since there's some groups that we hope to vaccinate more quickly than others, and hesitancy in this group is even more important to understand. And also the psychological mechanisms might be different in these groups in terms, for example, of perceived benefits of the vaccine. Anya has written the following question. Sorry, Anya, well, I guess I could maybe allow her to talk. Does it work? Anya, can you talk? I think I got myself to manage the, no, she cannot talk. Okay. I'm wondering whether you happen to include any questions that evaluate whether people bought the information in the informational treatment. For instance, asking them ex post what the willingness of others to get vaccinated is. Do they think it's the value you said or a different value? The reason I ask is because it might shed light on whether people whose willingness to get the vaccine was left unchanged because they were A, unconvinced by the information, or because they B, bought the information, but that information is not what matters to their attitudes. Other things matter more. Maybe this is a pure academic detail about how we think about attitude change, but it came up for me anyways. And she cannot speak because she's in the library. Okay. And she also asked why did you guys chose Biden instead of a local politicians? And I think you did it because it needed to work for everyone, right? That's what you explained. Okay, I think these were the questions. If you wanna come back and respond to some of the comments and questions, you have about like 4 minutes, so it's not a lot. But we can run a little bit over time.
Yeah, I mean, I can start with some of the questions and then others feel free to chime in and help out. I guess to the last question of the why Biden, as Vicky said, we wanted to work for everyone, but we also wanted to send like a message of like even if the U.S. president gets it, it's like big signal that if the U.S. president is getting it, it must be like a safe vaccine. There are some questions, like we do have data we can check on heterogeneous effects on vulnerability, as Chiara mentioned. So things like age, but we also asked about prior experience with COVID. So like if you had COVID or if you knew someone who had serious case or even death with COVID, or if you lost a job from the economic fallout, how that affects hesitancy. But we still haven't run those heterogeneous analysis yet.
I think we did run, sorry to quickly jump in, heterogeneous effects by age and find no differences there, but we should check these sort of like health related comorbidities and stuff, but at least for age we don't find anything. And one quick extra thing on the Biden thing, at the time that we fielded the survey, like politicians in Latin America hadn't been vaccinated yet, and we wanted to be honest about the actual vaccination and say that it was something that like actually happened. So we would have maybe liked to do that, and we even discussed doing the Pope potentially, but the Pope also hadn't been vaccinated yet, so we were kind of like time constrained there by when we fielded the survey also.
Yeah, and one thing that came up in both Vicky and Rodrigo's comments is like more in the context of vaccination in Latin America, where it's like for other vaccines, like actually vaccination take-up is quite high. Like if you look at the take-up rate of MMR, HPV, like all those other, it's quite high. But for COVID specifically, like we're seeing, it tends to be lower. And even if, so the other surveys that Rodrigo showed, it's like from like 70s, 80s, it might still not be enough to get to the 90% that Dr. Fauci suggested, but it is concerning that for COVID specifically, given levels of misinformation, it's so much lower than the take-up rate for other vaccines that people take up here all the time in the region.
There's also the comprehension question, I think. I think that's a really good question. I mean, we can't speak to necessarily like buying, whether they bought the information, which is interesting, but we can speak to like whether or not they were comprehending the information at least. So we did ask about like about like whether vaccines were approved, right, in various countries. Remember, the informational treatment script basically said that they had been approved in various countries, and the degree of the side effects. So if I remember correctly, we gave like 3 options. Like generally there are no side effects, generally there are minimal side effects, generally there are serious side effects, and people who got the treatments tended to answer those more significantly more correctly. So they're retaining or they're at least comprehending the information, but I don't quite know if we can sort of like speak to the idea of whether people who were like left unchanged were unconvinced by the information, or it's not something that mattered to them. But we can think about how we might try to get at that. It's a good suggestion.
Yeah, we do also have that information on like what concerns were addressed by the information treatments, and that might be something else that we could bring to like, and we have like a volume also of like text responses of people who wrote in like kind of additional concerns or additional reasons for hesitancy that I think probably not for this draft, but at some point it would be really good to look a little more descriptively and qualitatively at how people are expressing their concerns and what this like kind of getting a little bit more into those like psychological mechanisms that I think are like really academically interesting, but maybe a little bit less relevant to the policy debate.
Vicky, you're on mute.
Okay, so I think we've run out of time. We're right at the end of the event. This was very, very rich, very, very interesting. Thank to all of you for coming to present your work, which is incredibly timely given the pandemic. Thanks a lot to Rodrigo for fantastic discussion and comments. And to everyone who came, also thank you to this. And as I said at the beginning, you can come to other activities of the Institute of Latin American Studies. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. And we would look forward to listen to the next iteration of the final study once it's done.